Most people think that diet is the foundation of good health. But what if I told you that there's something much more foundational that affects our hormones, our energy levels, and even how our brain works? And nobody's talking about it. It's not talked about much in the health guru community. And that thing is light. And nothing has done more damage to our health than the disruption of that relationship between our bodies and light during the day and nighttime. And me, myself, I suffered from low energy and chronic fatigue for many years. Modern life broke our natural design, and this channel is about restoring it one sunrise at a time. Over the last century, chronic diseases exploded in America. We're all kind of familiar with this. We've seen a lot of the charts, and we hear it in the media a lot. In 1960, only about 13% of Americans were considered obese. Now it's around 46%. And over 60% of Americans have at least one chronic disease, and many have more. And about 90% of our healthcare spending goes towards trying to fight chronic diseases. And it hasn't worked because the problem has gotten worse, in fact. So something is off, we're doing something wrong. And if we want to fix it, I think that we have to look at some more foundational aspects of health that go beyond just food and exercise. The EPA does something called the National Human Activity Pattern Survey, and they track what percentage of the time people spend indoors, or they track Americans' living conditions. And they found that Americans spend approximately 93% of their time indoors. So only about 7% of our time is spent outside. So obviously, Americans are indoor people. We're spending a lot of time indoors. And if you've traveled to other countries, you've probably noticed, especially in places like Southern Europe, but most of the world, people spend a lot more time outside. And I've been to Europe, and I live in the States, and I've noticed people are outside a lot more in most of the rest of the world. And in Europe, for example, one of the reasons is because people have smaller houses and apartments, and they just want to be outside because of that. Americans we're very used to being comfortable inside. We have massive kitchens and big living rooms, and I think the comfort is killing us, literally. If you look at photos of Americans in the 1960s and even the 70s, you'll notice that everybody was slim. If you look at beach photos, everybody was slim. And it wasn't because they ate super healthy. In fact, you hear more about healthy eating now than back then. Think about this for a second. In the 1960s, Americans were already eating highly processed foods. I mean, they had TV dinners. Those had been around since 1954, believe it or not. And breakfast cereals were everywhere. Those were actually invented in the 1920s, I believe. And Pop-Tarts hit the shelves in 1964. Yet, back then, only about 13% of adults were obese. Today, that number is over 40%. So if processed food was already common in the 60s and people were still relatively thin, then maybe food isn't the whole story. There has to be something much more fundamental that changed. To get a really good understanding of all this, it's good to know about a field called quantum biology, and it's the study of how light, the smallest particles in light affect our cells, and they affect the way electrons tunnel through our mitochondria in our cells. And that happens to be the place where energy is produced in our cells. I'm sure you remember that from the ninth grade biology. But it turns out that is the major source of health, because if your body's not producing adequate energy, you get sick. And if your body produces no energy, obviously you're dead. To really understand why light is the major factor in health, we need to go back about 15 million years or so. I want to take it back a few million years to a place called the African Rift Valley in East Africa. And it was the cradle of humanity, really, because that's where the first humans evolved. And that's where our genome got set. So around 10 to 5 million years ago, there were massive tectonic forces that began tearing the African continent apart. The ground split open, volcanoes erupted, and the landscape transformed dramatically. So what was once a pretty flat, forested region became this jagged, dramatic rift zone filled with deep lakes, volcanic soil, and vast open savannas. This was no ordinary place. The East African Rift sits right on the equator. It's bathed in some of the most intense and consistent sunlight on Earth. And I've been to East Africa, I've been all over Africa, so I'm very familiar with how hot that environment is. And the daily light cycle was very brutal, as I mentioned, and very precise. There was a lot of powerful ultraviolet and infrared rays that came down from dawn until dusk. And at the same time, this shifting geology created an ever-changing mosaic of these micro-environments. So, like fluctuating water levels, new food sources, and huge swings in temperature and humidity. There's a guy named Dr. Jack Kruse. He's a neurosurgeon, and he's one of the founders of quantum biology. And he calls this the crucible where our biology was developed. And so this combination of sunlight, the tectonic plates, and rapidly changing conditions created this perfect evolutionary pressure cooker. And it was here that these foundational signals for human energy were created. All these things that contribute to hormone regulation and brain development. This is where they were first written into our cells. This was the birthplace of our forgotten design. Let me introduce you to someone who lived right in the middle of that crucible. His name's Kael. Kael wasn't just some cartoon caveman. He was a real flesh-and-blood proto-human, an early Australopithecus living roughly 2 to 3 million years ago in the East African Rift Valley. These little guys were much smaller than modern people. Males were around 5 feet tall and up to about 110 pounds, and females up to 4.5 feet tall and about 70 pounds. Every morning, long before the sun climbed high, Kael would wake up with the first light, no alarm, no coffee, just the gentle rise of the intense equatorial sun hitting his skin. His body was beautifully tuned to it like a well-designed organic machine. Every morning as the sun rose, his cortisol would peak, giving him the energy he needed for the day. And during the day, Kael walked upright across the savannah. He foraged for whatever the local environment had. Tubers, fruits, nuts, insects, whatever he could get his hands on. Also, fish and shellfish were valuable sources of food from the lakes and streams that dotted the rift. What he ate changed with the seasons and the exact patch of land he was in. He lived in small, loose groups, not big tribes yet, those came later, but these were small bands that moved together. They shared food and they watched out for each other. At night, he slept in trees or simple shelters, safe from predators like the saber-toothed cats that were roaming around at the time. His body wound down as the sun disappeared and the darkness signaled deep, restorative sleep. To us, this might sound primitive, but to Kael, it was perfect. His mitochondria, those well-tuned engines that are inside his cells, ran like beautifully designed Ferrari engines. They absorbed the photons of light from the sun every day, and they gave him all the energy he needed for the day. The combination of the strong morning sun, the local environment, the movement throughout the day, and the darkness at night made for the perfect environment for a healthy body. And according to Dr. Jack Kruse, this environment was far more critical to the health of these proto-humans than the food in the local environment. And the combination of the sunrise in the morning and high noon sun and then the evening sun was the master signal that led to the development of the brain and also the gut, and eventually the brain-gut axis, which is a very important part of our biology. Kael wasn't struggling to survive. In fact, in many ways, he was thriving in the environment he was designed for. And this was where our forgotten design was written, not in some abstract theory, but in the actual flesh and blood body of a proto-human like Kael. And here's the part that blows my mind. That blueprint that was in Kael is still in us today. And the more we stray from that, the sicker we get. And we have to remember that we are still those people from a few million years ago. We're just in a different form, and we have to listen to those blueprints. Otherwise, the more we stray from our natural design, the sicker and fatter we get, and that's what we see today. And really, what has made modern life really bad for a lot of people in terms of health is that we've strayed from this forgotten design of ours. At first light, ultraviolet and infrared rays draped Kael's skin and eyes, and it triggered a clockwork-like cascade. Cortisol rose to sharpen his mind and mobilize energy, while his mitochondria began producing energy with the efficiency of a Rolls-Royce engine. And by midday, the full spectrum of light optimized what we call cellular redox, and this is the delicate balance of electrons that really determines whether a cell thrives or slowly dies. As the sun dips toward the horizon, the fading light signaled the release of melatonin, gently guiding his body into deep, restorative sleep. And something a lot of people don't know, even in the scientific community, is that human evolution was guided heavily by RNA viruses in the local water sources, the lakes and streams, and also the ocean along the rift. And it was pivotal in the development of the brain. And I'm going to explain how that happened in future episodes. But it's a pretty fascinating story, and a lot of people don't know it. It's kind of buried in scientific papers. If you look hard enough, you can find those papers. But it's really interesting. RNA viruses actually led to the development of the human brain, the explosion in the human brain, because they inserted bits of RNA into our genomes, into the genomes of people like Kael at the time, and it led to explosive brain growth. And I'm going to get into how that happened in future episodes. Horizontal gene transfer, which is the direct swapping of genetic information between two organisms, this happened at an accelerated pace. New traits appeared in the relative blink of an eye. Brain size expanded in relatively short windows of time. And the fossil record shows few clear transitional forms because the changes were often swift and dramatic. And a lot of us believe that, or at least in the scientific literature, it's told that humans evolved extremely gradually through random mutations, through natural selection. But in fact, we evolved much, much faster than we think. And a lot of this happened because of the gene transfers from these RNA viruses into the genomes of people like Kael. So these RNA viruses were kind of the engine behind the explosive growth of the human brain, as I'd mentioned. It was really viruses and the combination of viruses and light and the local environment which really rewired the human brain and made us into the most intelligent species on Earth. And as I mentioned, this happened in rapid bursts called punctuated equilibrium. It's an actual thing in evolutionary biology, but it's kind of been suppressed in favor of the more neo-Darwinian views of how humans developed from people like Richard Dawkins and other modern neo-Darwinists like that. And those guys believe that human beings evolved extremely slowly and gradually over time, as I mentioned, over millions of years through basically random mutations. And we now know that that's mathematically impossible for something even as complex as, like a fingernail, which is relatively simple compared to a human brain. But this entire process of evolution, through punctuated equilibrium, happened sometimes in the blink of an eye. There were literally developments in the human brain that happened really, really quickly. And that's why we don't see, a lot of times we don't see transitional forms in the fossil record. So the standard notion that a lot of these Darwinians have is mostly incorrect. Most of what we know about evolution is actually not correct. The same mechanism that shaped Kael is still in us today, and this happened very quickly. and under intense pressure. The code was written really fast in a world saturated by light and viruses. And once it was written, it became the foundation for everything that followed. And a lot of people will blame their health conditions on genetics when in fact it has a lot more to do with the environment they're in and how they utilize the environment. And it turns out that our health is a lot more dependent on what we call epigenetics rather than genetics. So you have your genes, and yes, that does affect the way you turn out in life. But it doesn't make any sense that our destiny would be basically written in code and non-adaptable or unchangeable. All organisms respond to their environments because that's how you survive. So it turns out that our health is a lot more dependent on epigenetics than genetics. And we saw that with these ancient proto-humans like Kael. Some groups of Kael's kind moved north into what is now the Middle East and Europe, and others traveled eastward into Asia. And over tens of thousands of years, even a few reached the far northern latitude, and much later, some of them crossed into the Americas. With each step further and further away from the equator, the intensity of the light changed. The sun was lower in the sky. There was less ultraviolet and infrared light in the sun throughout most times of the day. And it became more difficult to get the nutrients from the sun that people like Kael had originally gotten on the African savanna. At first, these mismatches were tiny and imperceptible, but it became more and more apparent as time went on that these mismatches were getting bigger. You know, it might have been a bit less cortisol being produced in the morning or less melatonin being produced to help with sleep at night, and a bit less efficiency in the energy production in the mitochondria. And these were the first signs that our ancient design was being tested. However, over many generations, these groups did adapt and they became the different racial and ethnic groups that we have around the world right now. Skin lightened in the north to capture vitamin D better. And the diets changed according to the local environments. The Inuit they developed a remarkable metabolic flexibility. And Europeans developed lighter skin to capture more vitamin D in the atmosphere. And Europeans also developed mechanisms to handle the seasonal swings in light. But even with all that, the original code on the African savanna was still the gold standard. And even though all these humans had adapted to their environments, it's still within our genome for people all over the world that the ideal environments are the ones where there's still the most sun. So being as close as you can to the equator, regardless of where you come from in the world, is the ideal place to live. This channel is about how we forgot our design and how we can begin to reclaim it. If you've ever felt sick or tired for no reason, or if you've ever felt this feeling that there's something about modern life that feels a bit off, then you know part of the story, and the rest is waiting to be remembered. Welcome to our forgotten design.